Let's look at international issues. And now we're joined by SABC News international editor Sophie Mokoena, who is joining us to look at the meetings, that relate to the G20. Sophie, lots to talk about as far as the G20 is concerned, but let's look at the two-day meetings and the meetings that are to take place. Who will be in attendance for this one?
Well, the invitation was extended not only to members of the G20, but also to other countries as well, including regional organizations that are quite important in terms of the trade and political relations with South Africa, to ensure that the foreign policy of South Africa is properly interpreted in terms of strengthening the relations and looking at the theme of the G20 Summit. But let's take a listen at what the two officials who spoke to the media today had to say about who is coming and the importance of this gathering.
The countries that were invited, but who are not full members of the G20. So it is Singapore, the Netherlands, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Spain, Egypt, Nigeria, Ireland, Norway, Ethiopia, and Angola. Most of these countries have been invited to many of the recent G20 presidencies, so they are not new to the work of the G20. Angola comes in as well as the new chair of the African Union for 2025. As you know, that the African Union is now a full member of the G20. In terms of the geopolitical issues, I think we will be taking lessons from the presidencies of Brazil, of India and Indonesia on how we can manage this so that it does not derail the work of the G20. And a part of what we are going to be proposing to G20 members is that the geopolitical issues should be discussed by Sherpas, by the foreign ministers during this meeting and subsequent meetings of foreign ministers and the leaders themselves in November, so that the work of the rest of the G20 in the working groups, as you know, in the Sherpa track alone, there's about 15 working groups, so we don't want those working groups, their work to be derailed by a focus on the geopolitics.
South Africa's G20 presidency carries tremendous responsibility, given that the decisions taken by the G20 can impact the lives of all members of the global community, notably the most vulnerable and needy. South Africa is the only African country that is a permanent member of the G20, and therefore this is the first time in the G20's history that an African country will preside over this august bloc of developing and developed countries. The world faces a myriad of global challenges and continued sustainable development reversals. The current global situation suggests that the international community requires a profound paradigm shift characterized by solidarity, harmony, and mutual respect. In this regard, the G20 has a significant role to play in fostering global cooperation, collaboration, and partnership to address these challenges and achieve sustainable development.
And Sophie, two questions, arise from that. Let's begin first with what, both of them had to say. Is that clearly DIRCO is saying they want to focus on ensuring that they deal with global political challenges. What are the main ones?
Well, clearly the main ones are issues related to conflict. You know that there's a war in the Middle East, there's a war in Ukraine, and these member states, they do differ in terms of what needs to happen to ensure that there's peace in the Middle East, there's rebuilding of Gaza, including the issue of Ukraine and Russia, as you heard during that meeting of Minister Lamola and the EU, that the EU is saying that this war is in Europe, and therefore Europe must be involved. And therefore the talks yesterday, that is Russia and the United States of America, doesn't go far enough to be inclusive. South Africa is also saying we've played a role pushing for a solution or peaceful resolution to this issue, and therefore we will continue to support that. Those are the main issues. And the other issue is around the transformation of multilateral organizations such as the United Nations, because people are saying particularly the Security Council is paralyzed and it has failed to discharge its responsibility of maintenance of peace around the world. We see these conflicts in Sudan, in the DRC, and therefore these are challenging issues that are likely to derail the discussions, and that is why foreign affairs ministers must deal with these issues so that the other work streams and the other coming meetings are able to focus on issues that they have to deal with. And also then these matters that are very difficult can also be finalized by the heads of states who will be meeting in November during the main summit of the G20.
So in light of these meetings, right, can we see, of course, the meeting tomorrow is going to be dealing with a number of issues, but next week the ministers of finance are going to be meeting. So will the meeting tomorrow then be able to ensure that political issues don't play out on the margins of the finance meeting that needs to address the global economic challenges?
You can't guarantee that. I mean, for example, America is sending not a senior delegation, it will be someone from the embassy. And therefore, when these burning issues are discussed, the person who will be representing the United States of America, the largest economy, second largest economy in the world, and a very powerful country, it will not be represented by the Secretary of State. Now, next week, the Secretary of Treasury will be here, and therefore you'll find a situation where some countries will take opportunity during bilateral to weigh in on these challenging issues. So you can't guarantee that on the margins of the ministers of finance and the central bank governors, these political dynamics around the world are not going to play themselves out, particularly on issues relating to rebuilding, because when you talk about rebuilding, you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about resources, that is money. And therefore you have to talk about the IMF, the World Bank, how they will play a role to rebuild Gaza, to rebuild Ukraine, and therefore the politics might be there, particularly on the margins of the summit, and therefore you can't guarantee that America might not make a powerful statement that speaks to that, even though you're speaking to the minister or the representative or the Secretary of Treasury. We saw even during the visit of the previous Secretary of State, where when she was in the country, she spoke about other political issues, even though her responsibility was to engage on economic issues.
And when you look at America, right, and their decision not to send the Secretary of State, but sending the Secretary of Treasury in the next meeting, how would one say they arrived at this decision?
Well, I think with the foreign affairs, they were sending a message that they don't agree with South Africa on many issues in relation to global politics. But on the issues of the economy, the restructuring of the economy, there's vast interest. Because when you look at how Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, and those around him like Elon Musk are operating, they are transactional. And therefore, it's all about transactions. And therefore, there's more interest in the meeting of the Reserve Bank or central bank governors and also the foreign affairs, because finance, because you are going to discuss the economy of the world. And they have more interest in that because he is transactional.
And as you say, that, you know, when you look at the bilaterals that will be taking place, there's a lot that maybe some other countries can be looking to do, especially with the vacuum that has been left by the US. But let's see then how it plays out. Sophie, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. That was my colleague, the SABC News International editor, Sophie Mokoena.